right? And these wards are sort of like prisons. Like, it's not quite as bad as a prison, and in a lot of ways, it's better than a prison for sure. But there's bars. You can't go places. You're being watched constantly. You're stripped naked. If you question the psychiatrist on duty, you can be drugged. You know, you are kind of treated like an animal in a lot of ways, and people are dropping like flies to the ground in the ward. There's lots of young people, students and veterans, disenfranchised people. It's kind of like a pound. Like, if there's a stray cat, what do? They take the cat to the pound, right? But when you're a human being, you can't really do that. So the way they get around the stigma around that sort of treatment of people is they just say, well, we're helping them. They have a mental problem. They're questioning authority or whatever. So then, let's just take them there and drug them and make everybody believe that they're doing them some kind of great service. So basically, I'm being watched every 10 minutes. I'm stripped naked. And then, I'm talking to the psychiatrist, I'm talking to the doctor. He has an intake. And in the intake process, he doesn't really listen to what I have to say. Big surprise, right? Like, he takes 2-hour lunches, but then he doesn't take a full context for what his patients are saying, right? So he just orders that I'm drugged against my will with lorazepam, and this is a neuroleptic, right? The neuroleptic blocks dopamine receptors in the brain, and dopamine receptors are fundamental to reward anticipation, goal setting, also things like critical thinking skills, fine motor movement. And you see this too in the ward. People shake all the time like they have Parkinson's disease because it interferes with the ability for fine motor movements. And they just fall to the ground. And it really is. It's the chemical lobotomy. It really is. So, the doctor, he tells me that I have a tangential thought process. What does tangential thought process mean? That means I have some critical thinking, and my thinking deviates from the conventional narrative. It deviates from the convenient narrative that those in positions of authority are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So my very existence is sort of a threat to people, right? Because it exposes the problems that they're having. So that's what tangential thought process is. And the solution to that is just drugging people into catatonic states so that they can't think anymore at all. They're just sleeping for half the day, shaking like a leaf. And this actually works because they can convince people that they have a problem in their brain. They convince people by using gaslighting techniques that their experience is not real, their awareness is the problem, things like that. So I'm surviving in this psychiatric unit, right? And it's kind of like Shawshank Redemption, right? Like, we kind of have little breaks. People can take smoke breaks or whatever. They go outside, maybe play a little bit. They sit around all the time, and there's really nothing to do. You just sit around and that's it for days on end, watched constantly, even when you're sleeping. And I'm cheeking the medications. They call them medications, but I really don't think that they're medical at all. So, and this is another problem. They don't want to give people free healthcare, but they will subsidize giving people these kinds of psychotropics. Yeah, so that's kind of troubling too. So I'm cheeking the medications. I'm trying to spit it out when nobody's looking, which is very difficult, because everybody's watching you constantly. And cheeking it, they also check under your tongue. They check, you know, so you have to be very sneaky when you're doing this, right? And I'm smart enough to realize that I can file for what's called an emergency writ of habeas corpus. And in English common law, an emergency writ of habeas corpus means in Latin something like hold the body, right? So you can't just incarcerate somebody without a trial. It's not legal. So that's what they were doing to me. So I can file for an emergency writ of habeas corpus, which means that they have to have the burden of evidence to hold me there. That I'm crazy. I'm gravely disabled. I'm delusional. uh, you know, things like that. So I demand a trial, and previously, um, I actually, uh, I'm kind of embarrassed at this, but I did end up in a New York Times article, and this was in coordination with the clinical psychologist, the controversial clinical psychologist Dr. Jordan Peterson. And my discussion with Dr. Peterson was at a time when I felt very disillusioned by the school. I felt like, okay, so there's no solidarity for me on campus, and I have no idea how to navigate anything, and everybody's completely inaccessible. So people, what they were doing is they were turning to these alt-right demagogues like Dr. Jordan Peterson for self-help. And this is also partly what culminated in Free Speech Week at the school, which I don't condone. And actually, at this point, I'm a progressive and I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter. But I did talk with Dr. Jordan Peterson, and during my talk with him, he did tell me that, you know, it's no bloody wonder that I'm anxious. That doesn't show that I have a mental problem. That shows that I have a problem and that I'm sane and awake. So, as much as anybody may disagree with Dr. Jordan Peterson, that did end up in the interview that I had with him.
Or
Yeah, that's
yeah.
all complete bloody rubbish.
Right.
You didn't have an anxiety problem, you had a problem.
That's what I think, and I was
Yeah.
I was watching.
Like a therapist that has any sense is someone who distinguishes between people who have an anxiety problem and who have a problem. You had a problem. You had a problem with university, and you had a problem with configuring your future. It's no damn wonder you were anxious. You are obviously a person who's high in trade openness.
Okay.
And like you've got a technical bent.
And so in the ward, and when the administrative faculty at the school are telling me that I have a mental problem, we have many people telling them and telling me that that's not the case. It's just very simply that I'm awake and sane. So I have this hearing with the public defender, right? In the Superior Court, we had to set up a little office in the psychiatric unit for this. And, you know, we had the trial, and I brought up the Dr. Jordan Peterson comments. I offered evidence, you know, for my security clearance, things like that. But then they weren't entirely convinced. And I felt lost and defeated. I felt like, oh crap, this means that it doesn't matter how sane I am, I am just gonna be screwed over. Like, who knows? Maybe I could just be abused in this psychiatric unit. Maybe I could be put on so much medications that I don't wake up. You know, these people, they can just do anything. I mean, even the judge is just ignoring evidence, right? So after that, the psychiatrist actually escalated my 5150 to a 5250. He doubled my dose, and this was on this high dose neuroleptic that I was already on. But he did say in the trial that he doesn't believe that I'm a harm to others or a harm to self, but I'm just gravely disabled, and I don't recognize I have a mental problem on my part. And that was his rationalization and justification for drugging me, that I don't have adequate consent for treatment on my own, and I need him to intervene and drug me, right? So it's sort of a tautology, right? So anything where you're questioning the psychiatrist can be perceived as incompetence on your part, right? That can be used to justify having the psychiatrist intervene and step in and drug you by force. Because the psychiatrist is seen as having the information for consent that you don't have, right? So I decided that at that point I really needed to begin to resort to subversive tactics. So I had to compile a sort of psyops strategy to get out of there. And what I did is that I was talking with the nurses. I kind of won over a lot of nurses in the ward. I started drawing a lot of pictographs when I was in there, and you know, I started getting stories from all of the other patients, and a lot of the things I was hearing was obviously very troubling, right? So I began to interrogate the psychiatrist, because the psychiatrist is required by law to answer the patient's questions. And a lot of the ways in which he was answering the questions were very troubling, and I actually cornered him. And, he was kind of sweating quite a bit. So then I compiled a document outlining the abuses of staff in the ward, the police, and the hospital, and then I had them print the evidence of my clearance and everything that I was claiming, and then I returned to the public defender to appeal my decision. And this is my second trial. This is, well, not my second trial, but you were able to appeal the decision, and basically this puts a higher burden of evidence on their part to hold me in the ward. Evidence of my quote-unquote grave disability or delusional status or incompetence and inability to consent to treatment and so forth, right? And this whole idea of inability to consent to treatment to rationalize forcing drugs on people, well, isn't it the job of the psychiatrist to inform the patients? Well, apparently not. It's just used in such a way that any time that a patient disagrees with the psychiatrist, then that reflects a lack of informed consent on the part of the patient. In other words, the patient doesn't know what they're talking about, and then that's evidence enough to use force, which is really radically against the idea of consent, but that's okay. Who knows? Maybe I don't really want to know what this psychiatrist was involved with in college. So during my second trial, my public defender, she advises me to see a new judge. So I don't really think that when you see the same judge twice, it's as likely that you'll have a positive outcome as if you saw a new judge the second time, a fresh set of eyes, right? So that's what she told me to do. Well, she didn't tell me to do that. She just said, well, maybe you should think about doing that. She doesn't want to make the advice too straightforward. She's kind of a public defender attorney kind of person, right? Okay, so she's using this legal stuff with me. So I go into this tribunal, and the psychiatrist was presenting his statements about how he believed that, I was incompetent in spite of the fact that I was able to write up a legal case while simultaneously being drugged with high-dose neuroleptics in a psychiatric unit with little outside assistance. For some reason, he still was trying to tell the judge that I was just not technically competent and gravely disabled, but he kept going, right? But increasingly, he seemed kind of off the rocker. He kind of seemed a little bit unhinged, and people were kind of catching on to that. Is this guy really so gravely disabled that we have to have this last resort treatment of high-dose neuroleptics? He seems like he's presenting a cogent case. Maybe he's slightly disheveled, but okay, well, he is in a psychiatric unit, which is sort of like a prison, so that's to be expected. And I did speak, and I told them about all of this, and at this point, I had already interrogated the psychiatrist, and I presented those documents as well. So the public defender, she's like, well, he's clearly not gravely disabled, okay? Maybe he's disabled mentally to the extent of needing a compassionate education. The whole point of going to college is to receive a compassionate education to increase technical competency, but he's not gravely disabled to warrant a last resort forced administration of high-dose neuroleptic pills and forced incarceration against his will. So the judge ruled in my favor, and really he was not amused by this, and all of the nurses could see what was going on too, and they all sided with me, because what's happening really is completely ridiculous. We have students being locked up against their will. There's lots of young people in there, and oftentimes they don't have their parents to support them, and somebody somewhere screwed them over, and then the psychiatric treatment becomes a repressive strategy. And the judge ruled in my favor, and he ordered that I was immediately released. So they quickly carted me away and got me in a cab And they really were sweating bullets at that point. I started asking for the paperwork, and they had to give it to me. So I got all the paperwork, and they kept asking all these questions. Why do you want that? Why do you need that? You got to get out of here. Because the thing is, if they hold me and the judge has ruled that they can't have me there, then they could get in more trouble. So the cab left and picked me up and left me back where I started, back homeless. They're not supposed to leave people homeless, but I guess they just decided to arbitrarily ignore that. And actually, my attorney found a lot of problems with the way that they handled everything, but okay. So, not only did the school read about what happened to me, I sent them the documentation surrounding this, uh, but they encouraged me to return to treatment. So these are the kinds of individuals that are running UC Berkeley. Um, and a lot of people are waking up to the fact that they're being screwed over and ignored as students, paying record high tuition costs.